Many rifted continental margins around the world show an elevated topography, typically defined by an elevated plateau region separated from a broad coastal plain by an erosional escarpment. Not all rifted margins show this character, but it is very common, and many of these show patterns of decreasing apatite fission track age towards the rifted margin, and indeed this pattern shows up in all the low temperature thermochronometers. If we look at the southeastern Australian margin, especially along the classic transect between about Nimmitabel, past Brown Mountain at the escarpment, through Bega, out towards Tathra-Bermagui on the coast, we see this elevated plateau surface, the erosional escarpment, with a relief of about 900 metres, and the coastal plain going out to the present-day coast. This shows you from some of the older data from the 80s and 90s, the variation of apparent fission track age in apatites with distance from the coast. So decreasing towards the coast here, we see the broad background of late Paleozoic ages decreases to ages of around about 100 million years or less at the margin. There's also a distinctive pattern called a Boomerang Trend of mean fission track length against the apparent fission track age, where the oldest ages are characterized by relatively long mean track lengths, the intermediate ones by relatively short mean track lengths, and the lengths get longer again towards the youngest ages. We're going to look in a little more detail at this region here, which I'm just calling the Brown Mountain Transect. The Boomerang Trend is quite important for this argument, and it shows essentially the pattern you get. It's a mixing line between an older background age here by a younger event, and it's the intermediate ages here have no geological significance, but they are mixed ages made up of two different length components, the progressive loss of the old component and the increase of the young component, characterized by bimodal track length distributions in the middle. The only ages that have really geological significance in the sense that something happened at the time of the apparent age are these ones where the mean track lengths get up around 14 microns. There have been three different models that have been used to explain the formation of these rifted margins, formation of the geomorphology and the fission track age patterns. And they are this broad downwarp model where erosion has cut into a broad downwarped surface to produce the erosional escarpment, a scarp retreat model where the scarp has retreated from a former position at the rifted margin, and there has been isostatic amplification of the amount of denudation towards the coast, and the pin divide model, which is related to the position of a former drainage divide, and the escarpment hasn't actually moved greatly relative to that, but it has been developed by biting into that coastal region, again with a fairly substantial amount of isostatic amplification of the amount of denudation going on. All of these models assume implicitly that the pattern we see in the fission track ages and the present landscape features were formed by the same process. And that is an assumption that I think we now need to question. All of these models produce a different relationship between the apparent fission track age and the variation of with distance from the interior to the margin, and most studies have favoured either models 2 or 3, particularly model 3, as the most likely explanation. If we look at the whole region of southeastern Australia, we see the topography of the uplifted plateau surface separated by the escarpment here, part of the Great Escarpment identified by Clifolia in the early 60s, and the broad coastal plain. Looking at this Brown Mountain Transect in a little more detail, this is the study done by Malcolm McMillan for his master's thesis a few years ago. We see that the ages fall into 3 zones. The zone 1 vary between about 240 million years and about 290, with mean track lengths of around between about 12.5 and 13.5 microns, and unimodal track length distributions slightly negatively skewed, which is typical of an older slow cooling event. In between, we get in zone 2, we get mixed ages between about 140 million years and about 240, with mean track lengths which are much shorter, between about 10 and 11 microns in length, and many of them showing strikingly bimodal track length distributions, reflecting the two age components that are present. As we go into zone 3 near the coast, the apparent ages are between about 70 and a bit over 100 million years, and they show unimodal track length distributions with mean track lengths up around that 14 micron level. Looking at a much broader regional perspective, we have a great deal more data around the region than just in that one transect, which has been repeated now in 4 different studies, at least to my knowledge, all showing much the same pattern. But if we look more broadly at that same region and at a broader transect from about Goulburn through to the southern Sydney Basin, we can see the data superimposed on this boomerang plot here of mean track length against apparent apatite fission track age. The older ages have mixed but track lengths around about 12.5 to 13.5 microns. In the intermediate mixed ages, we get the mean track lengths going down to 10 microns or even a little lower, and going up again to about 14 microns for the youngest events. So just plotted on there the region, the period of rifting prior to the onset of seafloor spreading at about 85 million years. The dip in the boomerang trend gets down to lower values with the most recent measurements because the modern techniques are much more sensitive to detecting very short track lengths in the distribution. Putting this now together into a map view, we see this blue band here in the transect corresponds to the shortest mean track lengths. This is a plot of mean track length. And looking at the much more extensive regional data set, we can interpolate those to show that this trough in the boomerang trend here in the transect actually trends inland. And we can put the Great Escarpment there as a reference point, and we can see that in the transect region that has been studied so many times, it is more or less fortuitous that the trough in the boomerang trend occurs below the escarpment. To the north of that, that trend goes straight up across the escarpment and across the elevated plateau region. And therefore, it is clear that the pattern preserved in the fission track ages actually has nothing to do with the geomorphic expression on that rifted margin, which therefore must be younger. So what does it mean? If we put the Sydney Basin on there, the Permo-Triassic sediments of the Sydney Basin, this trend of the low point, the axis, if you like, of the boomerang trend, actually trends parallel to the edge of the western and southern margins of the Sydney Basin. And that suggests to us that, in fact, there was a much more extensive continuation of the Sydney Basin to the west and the south, which covered that plateau surface. And in fact, the plateau surface itself could well be the exhumed peneplain at the base of the Sydney Basin sequence. So we see regionally that this boomerang plot minimum trends inland. It crosses both the escarpment and the elevated plateau. It parallels the southwestern erosional margin of the Permo-Triassic Sydney Basin and suggests that the Sydney Basin was formerly more extensive, blanketing the area of this study until that area was stripped by erosion in around the mid-Cretaceous, producing that rapid mid-Cretaceous cooling event at around 90 million years, plus or minus 10 or so. Insolation by low conductivity sediments in this more extensive basin may well have led to elevated thermal gradients at that time, possibly enhanced by the chain of mid-Cretaceous magmatic bodies of that age. And the apatite fission track thermochronology of southeastern Australia is largely unrelated to the present landscape. The scale of post-rift denudation was probably only about 1 kilometre, consistent with what we actually see on the escarpment, and the major landscape features of the southeastern margin must significantly post-date the time of rifting.